In early 1944, the Pacific War was entering a decisive phase, one shaped not by a single battle, but by a chain of collapsing possibilities inside an empire stretched beyond its limits. Japan still occupied vast territories that stretched from the jungles of Burma to the remote atolls of the Central Pacific. On paper, it remained a giant, but underneath that surface, its war machine was cracking. Airfields were overworked, pilots were exhausted, fuel reserves hovered dangerously close to empty, and American pressure tightened every month. The skies above the Pacific had become a place where Japan could no longer afford mistakes. By April 1944, Berlin, thousands of kilometers away from the Pacific Front, had already begun preparing reports noting an uncomfortable reality. Japan's strategic situation was becoming operationally irreversible. The Wehrmacht, fighting its own desperate battles in Europe, recognized what Japanese commanders already feared. Losses were no longer replaceable. The year before had been brutal. Rabaul was isolated. The marshals had fallen. Truk, once the invincible fortress, was neutralized in a matter of hours. Japan's elite aviators, the small corps of men who had carried the early success of the empire, had been steadily whittled down. The training pipeline, once strict, methodical, and years long, was now a rushed assembly line. New students who would have once trained for 700 hours were graduating with barely one-third of that experience. Meanwhile, the United States was producing every day what Japan struggled to produce in a month: more planes, more fuel, more carriers, and crucially, more pilots. Japan was entering a war of mathematics, and mathematics was unforgiving. American B-24 and B-29 bombers pushing deeper into Japanese-controlled skies forced factories to disperse production. Aircraft plants were moved into tunnels, mountainsides, abandoned mines, anywhere that could hide them from an air raid. But underground factories came with a cost: slower production, lower quality, and constant shortages of skilled labor. Even the training fields, once quiet hubs of aviation discipline, were now threatened by American reconnaissance sweeps and occasional bombings. Students learned to fly under the sound of distant explosions. Officers wrote increasingly frantic reports. "We must replace combat pilots, but their replacements die faster than we can train them." By mid-1944, the heart of Japanese naval aviation was a hollow shell. All of this, every shortage, every lost pilot, every bombing raid, was pushing Japan toward a single unavoidable confrontation. A confrontation they believed could decide the entire war. Japan was preparing its last remaining carrier groups for one final operation: to halt the American advance in the Central Pacific. This effort, known inside the High Command as a decisive air battle, would eventually erupt into the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a battle that would become infamous as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But before that battle came the collapse. Before the collapse came the strain. And before the strain came the slow, quiet erosion of Japan's ability to fight. That erosion is where our story begins. As 1944 progressed, Japan's high command faced a decision it could no longer delay. Should it continue fighting a slow, grinding war of attrition it could never win, or risk everything on a single decisive confrontation? For the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the answer had already been shaped years earlier. Their entire doctrine, their training, their strategic thinking, everything rested on the idea of a decisive fleet battle, fought at long range where superior skill would break superior numbers. But by 1944, the doctrine was no longer aligned with reality. Visually, Japan's remaining carrier fleet still looked formidable: Shokaku, Zuikaku, Taiho, Junyo, Hiyo, Ryuho, a lineup that evoked memories of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raid, and early sweeping victories across Asia. But beneath the paint and steel, these ships suffered from an invisible wound. They no longer had the pilots to fill their decks. Aircraft were available. Carriers were repaired. Maintenance crews were experienced. But pilots, the irreplaceable ingredient of naval aviation, were now the thinnest link in the chain. The Japanese Navy tried to rebuild its air groups through sheer determination. Officers opened accelerated academies. Cadets flew more hours per week. But compressing a 2-year training program into a few months had predictable consequences. Young aviators flew with shaky confidence. Formation discipline collapsed. Landings on carriers became dangerously inconsistent. And combat instincts, the hardest skill to teach, were simply not there. In private memos, senior commanders wrote, "Our carrier decks will be full of aircraft, but not of aviators." Japan's problem wasn't just pilots, it was fuel. Every training sortie burned aviation gasoline Japan could not replace. Every maneuver at sea drained fuel tanks that were already dangerously low. Every carrier sortie, even a practice launch, consumed a resource more valuable than aircraft. By 1944, Japanese carrier groups could no longer train at sea for extended periods. Most pilots practiced takeoffs on land airstrips and simulated landings in chalk-marked zones painted on runways. It looked like training, it felt like training, but it wasn't training. This meant that when new pilots finally boarded a carrier, many were landing on a moving deck for the first time in combat conditions. While Japan struggled to keep its air groups alive, the United States was doing something unprecedented in naval history, producing carriers faster than Japan could sink them. In 1944 alone, the U.S. commissioned 12 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, hundreds of escort carriers, and behind them stood something even more decisive, a pilot training pipeline so massive it produced more aviators in a single month than Japan could train in an entire year. American pilots rotated from frontline combat to training assignments, then back to active duty, ensuring constant transfer of experience between generations. Japan, meanwhile, was cycling inexperienced pilots straight into battles they were statistically unlikely to survive. By May 1944, Japan's leadership understood the truth. If they did not commit their remaining carrier fleet soon, they might never get another chance. The American advance toward the Marianas threatened something far more important than territory. It threatened the airfields from which B-29 bombers could reach the Japanese home islands. If the Marianas fell, Japan would come under direct strategic bombardment, something the empire was utterly unprepared to face. So the High Command made its choice. Commit everything. Bet the entire war on one gamble. Stop the U.S. fleet in the Marianas or lose the empire. This became Operation A-Go, Japan's final, desperate attempt to reclaim strategic initiative in the Pacific. But commitment did not mean readiness. The fleet that prepared to sail was already broken where it mattered most. Behind every flight deck polished for battle, behind every Zero fueled and armed, behind every bitterly determined officer, was a reality no amount of bravery could erase. Japan was going into the biggest carrier battle in history with the weakest carrier air groups it had ever fielded. By early June 1944, Japanese naval leadership watched the American advance with growing alarm. Saipan, Tinian, Guam. These islands were not just dots on a map. They were the threshold to Japan's destruction. The only locations from which the massive B-29 superfortresses could reach Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and the heart of the empire. This was the nightmare that haunted the Imperial General Staff.
If the Americans captured the Marianas, Japan's home front would no longer be a distant abstraction in the war. It would become the front line. And so, the moment the U.S. Navy launched its assault on Saipan on June 15, 1944, every Japanese admiral understood the decisive battle could no longer be postponed. The Japanese combined fleet assembled under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, a respected veteran and one of Japan's last remaining carrier visionaries. His task: destroy the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance and halt the invasion of Saipan. Ozawa commanded a force that appeared powerful on paper: 9 carriers, 500 aircraft, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, nearly 60 ships in total. But what mattered most, the pilots, told a far darker story. Japan's carrier air groups were a mosaic of green pilots with less than 100 flight hours, instructors pulled from training academies, veterans flying despite injuries, and rushed replacements with almost no carrier landing experience. Many had never flown over open ocean. Some had never dropped ordnance on a moving target. A few had never taken off from a carrier deck until the fleet sailed. Ozawa knew this. Every admiral in the staff knew this. But they also knew Japan had no other choice. Across the Philippine Sea, the U.S. Fifth Fleet prepared for battle with a level of firepower the world had never seen. Admiral Spruance commanded 15 carrier aircraft, over 900 carrier aircraft, 7 fast battleships, dozens of cruisers and destroyers. But statistics were not what gave the Americans their overwhelming advantage. It was experience. The pilots of the U.S. Navy air groups were hardened by years of continuous combat. Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Marshalls. They were not perfect, but they were consistent, trained, rested, and equipped with the F-6 Hellcat, a fighter that statistically dominated every Japanese aircraft in the theater. These pilots flew, ate, trained, and slept on ships built for continuous operations. Their carriers could launch and recover waves of aircraft with machine-like precision. Their logistics were the envy of every navy on Earth. And behind them stood the United States industrial engine, producing more aircraft in a month than Japan could produce in 6. This was not a clash between equals. It was a clash between a modern, fully resourced war machine and a nation fighting with courage but no remaining reserves. Japan's planners believed they had one critical edge. Their carrier aircraft had longer range than American aircraft. This meant they could strike first. In theory, Japan would launch fighters, torpedo planes, and dive bombers from extreme range outside American strike range, forcing the U.S. carriers into a defensive posture. It was a sound idea. On a map, it made perfect sense. But the plan ignored the brutal realities of 1944. Longer range meant pilots were exhausted before the battle truly began. Inexperienced aviators navigating at maximum range were much more likely to get lost at sea. American radar could detect incoming rage from hundreds of kilometers away. Hellcats, guided by radar direction, were nearly impossible to surprise. Japan's advantage, the very foundation of Operation A-Go, was built on assumptions that were no longer true. As the combined fleet sailed toward the Philippine Sea, the problems began immediately. Pilots became seasick, unable to keep food down. Navigators panicked when radios crackled with static. Flight deck crews struggled to prepare aircraft under pressure. Takeoff accidents increased, and inexperienced aviators became disoriented during even simple training maneuvers. One Japanese officer wrote, "We were going into the greatest battle in the history of naval aviation, with units that were not ready for even a small one." Even worse, the fleet's fuel situation remained critical. Every wasted sortie reduced the fleet's combat endurance.
Japan was entering the decisive battle, already fatigued, already pressured, already at a disadvantage they could never hope to overcome. June 19, 1944. Sunrise over the Philippine Sea revealed two enormous fleets moving toward each other, the largest gathering of aircraft carriers ever assembled in human history. For Japan, this was supposed to be the moment they had prepared for since 1941, the decisive battle, the chance to halt the American advance, the opportunity to rewrite the course of the Pacific War. Instead, it became something else entirely. At 5:30 a.m., U.S. radar stations aboard the battleships and carriers lit up with long-range contacts. The Japanese were launching aircraft hundreds of kilometers away. To the Americans, it looked like waves approaching on a beach. 30 planes, then 50, then 100, then 200. Radar operators calmly relayed headings and altitude. Fighter direction officers plotted intercept courses. And the Hellcats were launched, not in panic, not in desperation, but in a smooth, practiced, clockwork rhythm that only the U.S. Navy in 1944 could achieve. Japan believed range would give them the first strike. Instead, it gave the Americans early warning. At 10 a.m., the first Japanese strike force, 69 aircraft, approached the American fleet. They never got close. More than 120 F-6F Hellcats intercepted them, guided by radar like arrows to a target. The results were catastrophic. 42 Japanese planes shot down. Only a handful reached the fleet. None scored meaningful hits. One U.S. pilot, Lieutenant Alexander Vrachu, destroyed 6 dive bombers in 8 minutes and returned with half his ammunition. He later described it simply. It was like a turkey shoot. At noon, another Japanese wave, 128 aircraft, struggled toward the U.S. fleet. Many pilots were fresh from accelerated training programs, barely qualified to fly off a carrier deck. They were met by more than 200 Hellcats. Radar-guided American fighters tore through the formations, attacking from above, below, and the sun. Dive bombers jettisoned bombs just to escape. Torpedo planes never saw the carriers they were sent to destroy. Fighter escorts were overwhelmed instantly. By the time the survivors limped back toward their carriers, only 30% were still alive. Many became lost over open water and simply vanished. The third raid came in the afternoon. 47 aircraft, many of them Japan's last remaining veterans. They flew bravely. They flew skillfully. They died anyway. American fighters intercepted them far from the fleet, killing Japan's best pilots in minutes. A handful penetrated the Hellcat screen and dove toward the U.S. ships, only to be annihilated by the most intense anti-aircraft fire the Pacific had ever seen. 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 40mm Bofors, 20mm Ehrlichens, fully integrated fire control radars, continuous tracking systems. The sky around the fleet became a steel furnace. Not a single U.S. carrier was hit. The final Japanese attack was launched in desperation. Pilots who had flown once that day were forced back into their cockpits. Others were so exhausted they could barely stand. The formation broke apart in the air. Planes drifted off course. Some turned back due to engine trouble. Some simply disappeared into the Pacific. Those that continued were swallowed by the same radar-guided Hellcat screen that had destroyed every wave before them. One Japanese officer wrote in his diary, "It was not a battle. It was an execution." By sunset, Japan had lost over 300 aircraft, more than 90% of everything they launched. The Americans lost 29 planes. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, Day 1, was not just a defeat, it was the death of Japanese naval aviation. Years of training, doctrine, culture, and combat experience vanished in a single day. Ozawa's carriers still floated, but they were empty. They were museums, hulls without wings, steel without purpose.
The Imperial Navy was fighting a modern war with no air arm left to fight it, and the Americans knew it.
June 20, 1944. The morning after the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The skies over the Philippine Sea were empty. No Japanese aircraft. No returning strike waves. No survivors drifting toward their carriers. Just silence. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa still commanded the largest carrier force Japan had assembled since Pearl Harbor. But he had almost nothing left to launch. On paper, he still had 9 carriers. In reality, they were floating coffins. Throughout the night of June 19th, Ozawa surveyed his flight decks. What he saw was horrifying. Planes splintered, engines damaged, fuel lines ruptured, pilots missing, deck crews exhausted, hangars half empty. Japan had launched over 400 aircraft the day before. Less than 50 were still operational. Ozawa sent a message back to Tokyo. Our ability to conduct carrier air warfare has ceased. This was not an exaggeration. It was a death certificate. Admiral Raymond Spruance, cautious, methodical, chose to protect the newly invaded Marianas instead of chasing the Japanese fleet immediately. But Admiral Mark Michener, commanding Task Force 58, wanted blood. He recombined his carrier groups and shadowed the retreating Japanese. All day long on June 20th, American scout planes searched the empty horizon. Fuel was running low. Pilots were tense. Time was slipping away. Then at 3:40 p.m., a single scout plane radioed the words Michener had waited for. Enemy fleet sighted. The Japanese carriers were just within reach, nearly 300 miles away. Too far for a safe strike, but not too far for a one-way strike. Michener knew the risks. Launching bombers and torpedo planes this late meant many would return after dark, low on fuel, unable to spot their carriers. Some might ditch, some might disappear, some might die. But this was the chance to destroy the last Japanese carrier force. He gave the order, "Launch everything we have." Deck crews sprinted. Engines roared. Bombers rolled into position. One witness wrote, "It looked like every plane in the Pacific was taking off at once." Despite fuel shortages, fatigue, and the failing light, nearly 220 American aircraft hurled themselves into the sky. This was one of the most dangerous and heroic carrier strikes of the entire war. At 6:40 p.m., the first American planes sighted the Japanese fleet. What they saw shocked them. Japanese decks, nearly empty. Anti-aircraft guns firing weakly. Carriers maneuvering helplessly. No fighter cover. None. Japan's great carrier arm was already dead. Now the Americans came to bury it. The U.S. strike force attacked with ruthless precision. The Hiyo, a torpedo spread, struck her sideboard side. Fuel lines ignited. Explosions tore through her hangar deck. She sank within hours. 521 crewmen went down with her. The Zukaku, Japan's last Pearl Harbor veteran. Bomber groups hit her again and again. Her deck was torn open. Her elevators shattered. She survived the attack, but never recovered. The Junuyo, Chiyoda, Ryuho, all suffered heavy damage. Fires raged across their decks. Aircraft, fuel, and oxygen tanks detonated in violent bursts. The Taiho, Japan's newest, largest, and most advanced carrier, had already been sunk earlier that day, the victim of a single American submarine torpedo that triggered catastrophic fuel vapor explosions. In 2 days, Japan lost 3 carriers outright, and the operational usefulness of all the rest. The attack was a success. The return was a disaster. By the time American pilots headed home, darkness had swallowed the Pacific. Cloud cover hid the moon. Many planes were nearly out of fuel. Some pilots wept over their radios. Some prayed. Some simply accepted fate.
Admiral Michener made one of the boldest decisions of the war. Turn on the lights. Every destroyer, battleship, and carrier illuminated itself like a floating beacon. A suicidal move if Japanese submarines were nearby. But it saved lives. Pilots followed the glow of those ships like moths to a flame. Some made it, some crashed into decks, some ditched next to destroyers, some splashed into the sea. That night, more American lives were lost to darkness and fuel starvation than to Japanese aircraft. But the risk paid off. More than half the strike force was recovered. By dawn on June 21, the scale of the defeat became clear. Japan had lost, 3 carriers sunk, 2 more heavily damaged, over 350 carrier aircraft destroyed, thousands of irreplaceable crew and pilots. One Japanese staff officer wrote, "Our Navy was no longer a Navy." Admiral Ozawa sent his final assessment. Carrier air power is finished. And he was right. Japan would never again mount a strategic carrier operation, never again challenge the U.S. in the open Pacific, never again launch a true naval air strike.
The Imperial Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force. By the morning of June 21, 1944, the Philippine Sea was calm again. But beneath that calm lay a truth so devastating that many Japanese officers refused to speak it aloud. Japan had lost the war. Not officially, not politically, not in any formal statement, but strategically, irreversibly, finally. The Imperial Japanese Navy, the force that had carried Japan across the Pacific, that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had swept through Southeast Asia, that had once dominated an entire ocean, was gone. Not defeated, not damaged, gone. Japan still had battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, but they had no way to use them, because Japan was missing the one thing no factory could produce quickly enough: experienced air crews. The numbers were catastrophic. More than 2,000 elite aviators lost since Guadalcanal. 80 to 90% of carrier pilots dead by mid-1944. Training programs rushed, shortened, degraded. New pilots sent into combat with less than 100 hours of flight time. Some arrived at the front with only 50 to 60 hours, barely enough to fly, let alone fight. One Japanese instructor admitted, "We were training men to die, not to win." The U.S., meanwhile, was producing 5,000 new pilots every month, fully trained, fully equipped, and backed by unmatched industry. This imbalance was no longer a disparity. It was annihilation. Before the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the U.S. still had to worry about a Japanese counterattack. After it, America had complete freedom of action. The U.S. Navy could go anywhere, hit anything, land anywhere. There was no longer a Japanese carrier force capable of stopping them. Admiral Nimitz immediately understood the implications. So did Admiral King in Washington. So did the Joint Chiefs. From this moment onward, the Pacific was an American ocean. In Tokyo, the news of the defeat struck like a physical blow. The Imperial General Staff gathered in tense silence. Officers stared at each other, searching for excuses, but there were none. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo reportedly said, "If this is true, then we have no ability to continue the war." But Tojo could not admit defeat. Not yet, not publicly. Japan still had millions of soldiers in China, Burma, the Philippines, and the home islands. Surrender was unthinkable. So instead of ending the war, Japan doubled down. The loss of the carrier fleet forced Japan into a corner. If they could not win the war with pilots, they would try to win it with sacrifices. The Philippines, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, all of these battles would soon be drenched in the blood of Japan's last desperate gamble: suicidal resistance on land, on sea, and in the air. The first organized kamikaze units would be formed only months after the disaster of the Philippine Sea.
This was not because Japan wanted to fight with suicide tactics. It was because Japan had run out of pilots, and they knew it. Meanwhile, the Americans fully secured Saipan. This single island unlocked a new terrifying reality for Japan. B-29 Superfortress bombers could now reach Tokyo directly. American submarines continued strangling Japan's supply lines, and the next phase of the island-hopping strategy moved into high gear. From Saipan, the U.S. could leap toward Guam, Tinian, Iwo Jima, and ultimately Okinawa. Japan's defensive ring was collapsing, and they had no fleet left to stop them. Admiral Ozawa was devastated. He had lost almost everything: his air groups, his strike capability, his best officers, his chance to stop the American advance. In a report to the emperor, Ozawa confessed, "Our fleet can no longer fight a decisive battle." This was the first time a senior commander openly admitted what had been obvious since Midway. Japan could not win a prolonged war against the United States. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carriers never again fought a major battle. Their remaining planes were too few and too poorly trained. Their fuel reserves were almost gone. Their radar and anti-air systems were hopelessly outdated. Their doctrine, the decisive battle strategy, was dead. Yet Japan kept building fortresses, kept training new pilots, kept preparing for a battle that would never come. The Pacific War had changed, and Japan refused to change with it. This is the essence of strategic failure. While Japan's navy staggered from defeat, the consequences of America's leapfrogging strategy became increasingly visible across the Pacific. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers found themselves trapped on islands that had once been considered untouchable bastions. From Rabaul to Truk, from Ponape to the Marshall Islands, these garrisons had been cut off from supply, reinforcements, and communication. Rabaul's garrison numbered over 50,000 troops, dug into tunnels, bunkers, and fortifications designed to repel any amphibious assault. Coastal artillery, operational. Anti-aircraft guns, fully manned. Ammunition and supplies stockpiled for months. Yet the Americans never attacked. Instead, U.S. planners isolated the island by sea and air, blocked resupply ships, and continued the march toward the Philippines. For the soldiers on Rabaul, years passed in isolation. Disease and malnutrition became constant threats. Morale deteriorated under the crushing weight of inaction. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, many soldiers wept, not from defeat in battle, but from the absurdity of their survival. They had been trained, armed, and prepared for a fight that never came.
Truk Lagoon, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, fell victim to the same strategy. 45 ships sunk during Operation Hailstone still lie at the bottom of the lagoon. Fighter planes, bombers, tanks, and ammunition now rest as time capsules of a lost battle. Concrete bunkers, tunnels, and coastal guns remained untouched but strategically irrelevant. The garrison, numbering over 60,000 men, starved and weakened over months while waiting for a battle that would never come. The lesson here is stark. Tactical strength cannot substitute for strategic relevance. A fortress is only as valuable as the campaign that supports it. Across the bypassed islands, starvation claimed thousands. Disease swept through poorly supplied garrisons. Hope faded as they realized the world had moved on without them. The largest bypassed garrison, Rabaul's 110,000 men, represents the ultimate paradox of war. They had power, discipline, and fortifications. Yet they contributed nothing to Japan's defense. Their sacrifice was not in battle, but in waiting for a battle that would never come. This was war stripped to its harshest calculus. Lives expended without effect, resources deployed in vain, Strategy ignored. While Japanese soldiers starved on islands, the United States kept casualties low by avoiding unnecessary assaults, maintained momentum toward the Japanese home islands, preserved resources and manpower for decisive battles. In strategic terms, every bypassed fortress was a prison, not a battlefield. Every American soldier not lost in frontal assaults was a soldier available for the final push. Every day saved shortened the war and reduced American casualties exponentially. By the time the U.S. reached Okinawa and Iwo Jima, the enemy had been weakened not by firepower, but by irrelevance. The Pacific Campaign demonstrated a fundamental principle of modern warfare. Mobility trumps fortification. Initiative trumps strength, and innovation trumps tradition. Fortresses like Rabaul and Truk became museums to a principle the Japanese could not grasp. If the enemy refuses to fight where you want, your strength is meaningless. This is the ultimate lesson of strategic imagination. The war was no longer about who had more guns, more tanks, more planes. It was about who understood the map, the initiative, and the tempo of the campaign. And in that domain, the United States had already won. By mid-1945, the war in the Pacific had reached its decisive phase. The islands of the Central and Western Pacific that had once been formidable Japanese strongholds were now isolated, silent, and strategically irrelevant. The American advance, executed with surgical precision and strategic foresight, had left Japan vulnerable in ways its military planners could never anticipate. The campaign to capture the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam was a pivotal moment. These islands provided airfields within range of Japan, enabling B-29 bombers to strike the home islands directly. Japanese defenders fought fiercely, but the U.S. utilized overwhelming naval and air superiority. Casualties were high, but strategic timing and prior isolation of enemy garrisons minimized the risk of long, drawn-out battles elsewhere. In the Philippines, General MacArthur returned to fulfill his famous promise, "I shall return." Luzon, Leyte, and other key locations became battlegrounds. Japanese forces were trapped between advancing U.S. troops and supply shortages. Bypassed islands like Truk and Rabaul contributed nothing. Their soldiers watched in despair as the war moved past them. The lesson of leapfrogging was reinforced. Bypassing strong points, isolating enemy forces, and striking at the heart of Japan was faster, more efficient, and saved tens of thousands of American lives. By the summer of 1945, Japan faced a triple crisis. Isolated garrisons on hundreds of islands, consuming supplies but unable to influence the war. Naval power neutralized. The once feared combined fleet lay in ruin, anchored in silent harbors. Air supremacy lost. American B-29 bombers could strike virtually anywhere on the home islands. Japanese planners had prepared for a decisive naval engagement to destroy the U.S. fleet, a defense of the home islands that would inflict maximum casualties on invading forces. But America did not fight that war. The U.S. struck where Japan was weak. It avoided where Japan was strong. It bypassed fortresses, cut off supplies, and forced surrender through isolation. The result was a systematic collapse without the need to fight every battle Japan had prepared for. The capture of Okinawa in April 1945 demonstrated both the costs of frontal assaults and the wisdom of previous strategies. Japanese defenders fought with unparalleled tenacity. Kamikaze attacks inflicted heavy casualties on the U.S. fleet.
Ground combat was brutal and protracted. Yet, thanks to years of strategic isolation and attrition, the defenders could not receive reinforcements or resupply. Troop numbers were reduced. Ammunition and supplies were limited. Morale was fractured. American planners understood that Okinawa would be the template for the home island's invasion. Direct assaults would be costly. Strategic innovation could minimize casualties. The battles of Okinawa and Iwo Jima showed that the Pacific War was a war of maneuver, timing, and strategic calculation as much as of firepower.
By mid-1945, Japan's military position was untenable. Hundreds of thousands of troops trapped on bypassed islands, cities devastated by conventional and strategic bombing, supply lines severed, navy destroyed, airfields controlled by U.S. forces. Every bypassed fortress, every isolated garrison, every wasted resource weakened Japan's ability to defend its home islands. The final objective was no longer distant islands, it was Tokyo and the Japanese heartland. The leapfrogging campaign had created a chain of isolated, neutralized strongpoints. The Americans had achieved strategic dominance with minimal direct confrontation. The hardest battles were avoided until necessary. It was a masterclass in strategic imagination, a demonstration that war is won not by attacking strength, but by exploiting weakness. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the implications of the Pacific Campaign were clear. Fortresses can be irrelevant. Tactical strength matters only if strategically placed. Mobility and initiative trump static defense. Innovation in thinking, not just in weapons, determines the outcome. Preserving one's forces for decisive actions saves lives and accelerates victory. The U.S. had fought a war Japan did not expect, and won not just with firepower, but with strategic brilliance. The islands the Japanese had fortified so heavily were now silent witnesses, reminders that in war, thinking beyond the obvious can change the outcome entirely. August 1945, the world had been watching the culmination of a conflict that had reshaped nations, ideologies, and the very nature of warfare. Japan, once confident in its network of fortified islands and mighty fleets, faced inevitable defeat. Yet the most remarkable aspect of the Pacific Campaign was not the battles won, but the battles that never happened. Across the Pacific, hundreds of Japanese garrisons remained isolated. Rabaul and Truk, the largest bypassed strongholds, had remained untouched for over a year. 110,000 men, fully armed and fortified, were trapped on islands converted into prisons by strategic imagination. They endured hunger, disease, and hopelessness, preparing for a decisive battle that never came. When word of surrender reached General Imamura at Rabaul, many soldiers wept openly. Years of strict discipline and expectation of glory ended in quiet defeat. The soldiers were relieved yet broken, prisoners of a war that had passed them by. The process of repatriation took over 2 years. Survivors were weak and malnourished. The massive garrisons had never influenced the outcome of the war. What once seemed an impregnable fortress had become a symbol of futility. Truk Lagoon, now a popular diving site, still houses the sunken relics of Operation Hailstone. Ships, aircraft, and supplies frozen in time. Remnants of a fleet that had once represented the apex of Japanese naval power. The concrete bunkers, artillery emplantments, and tunnels remain intact, a testament to strength rendered irrelevant by strategy. The Pacific leapfrogging campaign demonstrated the power of strategic innovation over brute force. By bypassing fortified islands, America avoided protracted battles and catastrophic casualties. Resources were concentrated where they could deliver decisive results. The strongest defenses were neutralized not by firepower, but by isolation and irrelevance. American commanders proved that the hardest fight to win is often the one you never fight. MacArthur and Nimitz prioritized time, mobility, and efficiency over territory. Tactical strength meant nothing when the enemy was removed from the strategic equation. This approach influenced modern military doctrine, teaching commanders worldwide to exploit weakness and avoid strength.
Even as strategy saved tens of thousands of American lives, the war exacted a toll on Japanese soldiers and civilians. Bypassed garrisons suffered from malnutrition, disease, and isolation. Civilians faced firebombing, displacement, and uncertainty. The human cost highlighted that strategic brilliance does not eliminate tragedy, it redirects it. Yet the contrast between potential and actual combat was stark. 110,000 soldiers at Rabaul could have inflicted massive casualties if they had engaged. Instead, their strength became irrelevant, a lesson in the disconnect between tactical preparation and strategic outcomes. By the end of the war, the U.S. had demonstrated mastery of combined arms, logistics, and strategic imagination. Japanese defenses, no matter how formidable on paper, could not withstand a flexible, mobile adversary. Leapfrogging became a case study in military academies around the world, shaping doctrines for decades to come. Visitors to Rabaul, Truk, and Chuk Lagoon today witness silent fortresses and sunken fleets. Concrete bunkers still stand. Coastal guns remain pointed to empty seas. Ships and planes rest undisturbed beneath the waves. These are reminders that strength without strategic relevance is powerless, and that innovation often triumphs over sheer force. The story of the Pacific War is not just about victories or defeats, but about how thinking differently changes the outcome. America fought the war it needed to win, not the one Japan wanted to fight. Tactical, impregnable fortresses became museums of irrelevance. Soldiers, planners, and commanders learned that the battlefield is defined as much by ideas as by weapons. In the end, strategy, mobility, and imagination determined the fate of nations. By late 1945, the guns had fallen silent across the Pacific. The islands that had once seemed invincible were now empty. The sunken fleets of Truk Lagoon, the silent bunkers of Rabaul, and the overgrown airfields of bypassed garrisons spoke not of defeat in combat, but of a war decided by strategy. The Pacific War offers lessons that extend far beyond its geographic scope. Lessons about decision-making, innovation, and the human cost of conflict. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the liberation of the Philippines and the eventual approach to Japan, often emphasized a fundamental truth of war. Victory is not determined by who holds the most territory, but who shapes the campaign. The goal is to defeat the enemy efficiently, preserving your forces while rendering theirs irrelevant. Admiral Chester Nimitz, reflecting on the Pacific Campaign after the war, called the decision to bypass Rabaul the single most important strategic choice he made. It validated the concept of strategic mobility over static defense. It proved that time and lives could be preserved through ingenuity rather than brute force. It showcased that commanders who think creatively can achieve objectives without unnecessary bloodshed. Together, MacArthur and Nimitz redefined modern naval and amphibious warfare, turning the Pacific into a laboratory of combined arms, intelligence-driven operations, and logistics mastery. The Pacific Campaign demonstrated that static fortresses, no matter how well defended, can be bypassed and neutralized. Tactical strength alone is insufficient. Strategic irrelevance can defeat the strongest positions. Air and naval supremacy allow commanders to choose when and where battles occur. Military theorists studied this campaign for decades. Fortifications must now be integrated with mobility and supply lines. Commanders must understand that the battlefield extends beyond immediate terrain. Bypassing enemy strongholds can save lives and resources while accelerating victory. The leapfrogging strategy became a blueprint for post-war amphibious doctrine, influencing conflicts from Korea to Vietnam and beyond. While strategy saved tens of thousands of American lives, the war left deep scars on those trapped on bypassed islands. Soldiers suffered from malnutrition, disease, and isolation. They endured years of preparation for battles that never came. Their courage and discipline, though never tested in combat, remain a testament to the human dimension of warfare. The contrast between the soldiers who fought and those who never engaged reminds us that war is as much about decision-making and timing as it is about bravery and firepower. The story of the Pacific Campaign is not just history, it is a lesson for the present and future. Innovation often comes not through new weapons, but through new ways of thinking. Strength is only meaningful when applied in the right context.
The best battles are often the ones never fought, preserving lives and resources for decisive moments. Today, the lessons of Rabaul, Truk, and Chuk Lagoon resonate with military planners, strategists, and historians. Static defenses without strategic relevance are liabilities. Mobility, intelligence, and initiative are force multipliers. The enemy's strength can be turned into a weakness through creativity and planning. The Pacific War reminds us that history is shaped by ideas as much as by guns. Japan built fortresses to fight a war they envisioned. America fought the war it needed to win. The difference between tactical might and strategic foresight determined the outcome. From the silent tunnels of Rabaul to the sunken wrecks of Truk Lagoon, the lesson is clear. The greatest victories are often those achieved without firing a shot.
Beyond strategy and sunken ships, the Pacific War left a profound mark on the people who lived it, soldiers and civilians alike. The Japanese garrisons stranded on Rabaul, Truk, and other bypassed islands endured years of isolation. Food was scarce, rations dwindled to near starvation. Disease ran rampant, with dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition taking countless lives. Soldiers maintained discipline, drilled daily, and awaited a decisive battle that never arrived. Many wept when the surrender finally came, a mixture of relief and despair. One survivor, writing years later, recalled, "We prepared for a battle that never came. We trained. We fought ourselves against hunger and fear. And in the end, it was all for nothing." These men represent the invisible casualties of strategy, lives shaped not by bullets, but by time, geography, and circumstance. The civilian populations of Pacific Islands experienced the war differently. Towns and villages were destroyed by bombing raids and naval bombardments. Crops and fisheries were disrupted, creating famine and hardship. Communities were displaced, relocated, or evacuated as military operations swept through the islands. Yet, even amidst destruction, many civilians contributed to survival and resistance. Fishermen supplied food to garrisons. Local workers maintained airfields and docks under duress. Ordinary people became unsung participants in a war shaped by global strategy. For both Japanese and American soldiers, repatriation was a slow and emotional process. The 110,000-strong garrison from Rabaul took over 2 years to return home. Many soldiers returned to a Japan ravaged by bombing, shortages, and occupation. American soldiers, meanwhile, came home to a nation celebrating victory, but mourning the dead. The human cost of the Pacific War cannot be measured solely in casualties. Psychological strain, displacement, and the weight of waiting for battles that never came shaped the lives of tens of thousands. After the war, the islands were slowly reclaimed and rebuilt. Airfields became civilian airports or tourist destinations. Bunkers and tunnels were preserved as historical sites in museums. Sunken ships and lagoons became diving sites, preserving artifacts of the past. Former battlefields are now quiet, tropical landscapes, a stark contrast to their wartime intensity. Rabaul, Truk Lagoon, and other sites remind us that history is tangible. Visitors can walk through tunnels, dive among wrecks, and see the evidence of human ingenuity, courage, and suffering. While strategy and tactics dominated the Pacific campaign, it is the human stories that give the history its weight. Strategy saved lives, but it also shaped destinies in unforeseen ways. Soldiers and civilians endured fear, hunger, and uncertainty while the war moved past them. The resilience of humans under duress is a recurring theme, from fortified garrisons to small island communities. The Pacific War teaches that victory is measured not only in territory or sunken ships, but in the preservation of life and the endurance of the human spirit. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, the war was more than battles and strategy. It was a human story of isolation, courage, waiting, and survival. History remembers the generals, the ships, and the strategies, but the human heart remembers the waiting,
the hunger, and the hope that tomorrow would bring the end. The conclusion of the Pacific War did not simply mark the end of conflict. It reshaped military thinking, strategy, and the way wars would be fought in the modern era. The bypassing of strongholds like Rabaul, Truk, and other fortified islands was not merely a tactical choice. It was a revolution in strategic thought. Conventional wisdom dictated that fortified positions must be destroyed, no matter the cost. MacArthur, Nimitz, and their planners asked a simple question: is there a way to win without unnecessary bloodshed? The solution: isolate, bypass, and neutralize without direct confrontation. Tens of thousands of American lives were saved. The war was shortened by months, if not years. This approach became a case study in military academies worldwide. It demonstrated that mobility and initiative outweigh static strength. Control of supply lines and logistics can be as decisive as firepower. Strategic irrelevance can be the ultimate defeat for even the most heavily fortified enemy. Lessons from the Pacific War shaped the post-war military landscape. Naval and air superiority became the cornerstone of modern warfare. Commanders learned to avoid strengths and attack weaknesses, rather than engage every enemy position. Fortifications were no longer invincible. Their value depended entirely on strategic context. Innovation in thinking often mattered more than innovation in technology. Generals and strategists today study the Pacific Campaign to understand that winning a war is about choosing the right battles, not fighting all battles. Strategic irrelevance can be the ultimate defeat for even the most heavily fortified enemy. The future of military doctrine, lessons from the Pacific War, shaped the post-war military landscape. Naval and air superiority became the cornerstone of modern warfare. Commanders learned to avoid strengths and attack weaknesses, rather than engage every enemy position. Fortifications were no longer invincible. Their value depended entirely on strategic context. Innovation in thinking often mattered more than innovation in technology. Generals and strategists today study the Pacific Campaign to understand that winning a war is about choosing the right battles, not fighting all battles. The human cost reconsidered. While strategy saved lives on the American side, the war left profound human consequences. Japanese soldiers on bypassed islands endured starvation, disease, and isolation. Civilians faced destruction, displacement, and famine. The story of the Pacific War is as much about human endurance and suffering as it is about victory and strategy. Historians remind us every bypassed fortress represents a human story of waiting, hope, and survival. Today, the remnants of the Pacific War are preserved for posterity. Rabaul and Truk tunnels, bunkers, and gun emplacements remain as historical sites. Sunken ships in Chuk Lagoon are diving sites, time capsules of February 1944. Museums and memorials honor both strategy and sacrifice, teaching future generations the value of imagination, courage, and restraint. The Pacific War also left a philosophical legacy. Strength without strategic relevance is futile. Battles are won in the mind of the planner, not only on the battlefield. Innovation can triumph over brute force. Human life and time are the most valuable resources in war. The war in the Pacific was won not just by guns, ships, or planes, but by thinking differently. America fought the war it needed to win. Japan fought the war it wanted to fight. The difference was strategy, initiative, and imagination. As we look back 70, 80 years later, the lessons remain. Question assumptions. Avoid unnecessary losses. Use resources wisely. Consider the human dimension in every decision. Victory
in the Pacific was not defined by every island captured or every bunker destroyed. It was defined by the ability to achieve objectives with minimal bloodshed, maximum impact, and lasting strategic advantage. The story of the Pacific War is a story of strategy, courage, and humanity. It reminds us that the most important battles are sometimes the ones you never have to fight.
The Pacific War left scars across islands, oceans, and human lives. It was a conflict of extraordinary scale, unimaginable courage, and profound sacrifice. Yet, in the midst of destruction, a lesson endures. War is won not only by strength, but by wisdom, strategy, and imagination. The story of bypassed fortresses like Rabaul, Truk, and others teaches us. Tactical strength does not guarantee victory. Innovation in thinking can render even the strongest defenses irrelevant. Preservation of life and efficiency in planning are as crucial as firepower. America's leapfrogging strategy was not a story of brute force, but a story of careful calculation, bold decisions, and the courage to think differently. 110,000 Japanese troops endured isolation, starvation, and disease on bypassed islands. American soldiers were spared from potentially catastrophic assaults on fortified positions. Civilians in the Pacific faced the war's harshest realities, yet survival and resilience persisted. These stories remind us that history is not just about maps and battles, but about the lives touched, lost, and saved. Today, the remnants of the war, sunken ships, abandoned bunkers, and overgrown airfields serve as both memorials and lessons. Divers explored Chuck Lagoon, discovering time capsules frozen in 1944. Visitors walk through Rabaul's tunnels, witnessing the futility of static defenses in a dynamic war. Historians study the campaign to understand strategy, initiative, and the human dimension in warfare. The Pacific War reminds us that the smartest battles are often the ones never fought. Victory was achieved not by capturing every island, but by choosing the right battles, preserving lives, and thinking beyond the obvious. America fought the war it needed to win. Japan fought the war it wanted to fight. The difference was strategy, imagination, and initiative. In the end, history shows us that the power of human intellect, strategic planning, and courage under uncertainty can shape the course of entire nations. If this journey through the Pacific War gave you new insights into strategy, courage, and history, subscribe and follow for more documentaries that uncovered the hidden lessons behind pivotal moments of World War II. Explore the untold stories. Learn the strategies that changed the world. Honor the human stories behind the battles. Every click helps preserve these lessons for future generations. History is not just a story, it's a teacher.